Adam Louis-Klein is a writer, anthropologist, and philosopher. He holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Yale, master's degree from the New School and the University of Chicago, and is currently completing his PhD in anthropology at McGill University in Montreal. He conducted fieldwork with the Desana people in the Colombian Amazon. And after October 7, his life took a radical turn and he founded the movement against anti-Zionism, known as MAAZ, and became one of the most provocative voices in the debate on anti-Jewish hatred in the academic and public spheres. Thank you so much, Adam, for this interview.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with your movement against anti-Zionism. You bring a new perspective, a more academic perspective. Let's talk about it. You say that in order to fight antisemitism, we need to make a distinction between classical antisemitism and anti-Zionism. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so I think for a very long time, the frameworks we've been using to understand anti-Jewish hate have been based on a very specific model of what that looks like. And that I call classical anti-Semitism. It's what we usually mean when we use the word anti-Semitism. So, for example, the anti-Semitism of the late 19th century in Europe with people like Wilhelm Marr, eventually culminating in Nazism and the Holocaust, we all kind of have this imagery and these associations whenever we talk about anti-Semitism. But since 1948 and after the Holocaust, we've actually seen the mutation of anti-Jewish hate into what I think is a fully formed new construct. It's its own ideology. And importantly, it imagines Jews in new ways, right? It has new tropes and libels and stereotypes. So if anti-Semitism was really based on the trope of the Jew as a kind of non-white infiltrator of European societies, sort of the hook-nosed banker, right? That's kind of the archetype. We have a different archetype now. It's the white colonizer. It's the genocidal Israeli. It's the messianic fundamentalist settler. And these are actually images through which anti-Zionists imagine and stigmatize the Jewish collective. And so we have to actually recognize this new category of anti-Jewish hate in order to be able to fight back against it effectively.
And your model shows that anti-Zionism is made of three labels. The colonizer, the apartheid, and the genocide. Let's start with the colonizer label. How do you fight this label?
Well, so I kept seeing over and over again that the anti-Zionists were very invested in a certain conception of Jewish identity, actually, as being, in a sense, fake, at least insofar as it's constituted in Israel. So they are very invested in the notion that Israelis have no right to be in the land of Israel and that Jews are just a religion, not a people. So they will impose that definition on Jews. And when Jews respond and say, well, actually, we are a nation, we are connected to Israel in this way, we have elements of peoplehood, we're a kind of tribe, they will say that's Zionist propaganda. They will actually reject Jews' right to define our own identities. And that is all part of the complex of the colonizer libel, saying Jews are not foreign in my own country, right? I actually wish Jews would assimilate and just be good citizens here and stop claiming to be a people or a nation, but they're foreign in Israel. They don't belong in Arab land.
And how do you fight this label? What are the arguments that you use?
So I think that the Jewish community up to this point has been very dependent on trying to factually refute these claims. Now, I think that is a big mistake because it assumes that these claims are really designed to be refuted, that they're good faith criticisms of Israel, right? But if you look at the colonizer libel, just to take an example, it's not a critique of Israeli policy in some sense that's contingent or that would allow Israel to improve or whatever that might mean. It's really just a way of imagining Israelis as inherently evil, right? So for many of these kind of left-wing progressive audiences, right, the white colonizer is the epitome of evil. It's the European colonizers who invaded North America, who invaded Mexico and South America and stole land and committed crimes and used slavery. So all those historical sins are now thrown on the white colonizer. We have to understand the function of these accusations, the intent and the behavior of the people who are lobbying these accusations, instead of always just replying and giving people facts about Israel. So, what I really think is important and what the movement against anti Zionism promotes is flipping the gaze, not always talking about Zionism, but talking about anti-Zionism, describing what anti-Zionists do back to them, building a discourse about anti-Zionism, and then stigmatizing anti-Zionism as its own category of bigotry. So I think that confrontational approach works much better than defending with facts.
It's like attack instead of defense.
It's definitely more confrontational. At Maz, we talk a lot about setting boundaries. We are going to say, actually, you just can't do this, right? If I endlessly enter a discussion and a debate about Israel, I'm granting permission for anti-Zionists to lobby these libels at me. I'm granting permission for anti-Zionists to try and redefine my identity forcibly for me. Instead, I say, no, that's anti-Zionist libel. Anti-Zionism is a hate movement. I don't accept anti-Zionism. And then we start objectifying and talking about anti-Zionism as a thing. That's how I think we're going to place a dam on the flood of anti-Zionism that's just completely overtaking our societies right now.
How is this fight going so far?
Well, so the movement against anti-Zionism, we were formed only about 6 or 7 months ago, and we've already had immense success. In that time, we've seen a real change in the attitude, the energy, and most importantly, the language that a lot of the Jewish community is using, especially online. So one of the things we promote is a sharper and more direct language for naming anti-Zionism and for describing its libels like colonizer, apartheid, genocide. We see more people doing this. We see more people directly calling out anti-Zionists instead of relying on always mapping it back to anti-Semitism, because we don't think that works, right? Because they already have their rhetorical maneuvers to say, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. And it's this kind of endless game that goes on where they spread libels about Israel and then deny they're anti-Semitic and say they only hate Israel.
What is your strategy with social media?
Well, so we have gotten a lot of influencers, for example, to start using our language. We spread a lot of popular memes. So we use imagery and infographics to teach people about the history of anti-Zionism, because there are stories here that people don't know, right? So people don't really know about Shafik Ades, for example. In 1948, he was publicly hanged in front of his home in Basra, Iraq, because he was named as a Zionist traitor. People don't know about the Soviet Yevsektia, which was a group of Jews, the Jewish section of the Communist Party after the Bolshevik Revolution, who systematically dismantled Jewish life under anti-Zionism. So there's a whole wellspring of stories and cultural references to help people see and understand anti-Zionism and learn about its trail of harm, learn about the tokenization of Jews that it's done in the past. Just the people today have learned nothing about anti-Zionism. They've learned about the Holocaust and classical anti-Semitism. So when people then come along as anti-Zionists say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not like a Nazi, right? I'm not like a right-wing European anti-Semite, it actually sounds credible. But if we can teach people that anti-Zionism has its own history, it's its own thing, it's not a spontaneous reaction to Israel, I think we can change the discourse. You can go to our website, maazaction.org, maazaction.org. We have a lot of these stories also on the website because we want people to learn. We want these things to become cultural references. We imagine that one day there'll be museums to anti-Zionism. That's our vision. And we need all hands on deck to try and achieve it. We were all taken off guard by what happened on October 7th and after October 7th in the way anti-Zionism flooded the West. The Jewish community was not necessarily prepared. We're now gaining some clarity, but we need to move quickly because this hate movement, unfortunately, is escalating.
Anti-Zionism started before the creation of the State of Israel.
So there's kind of an earlier proto-anti-Zionism, yes, from two sources. So you can look at what Vladimir Lenin was writing in the early 20th century. He had a number of polemics with the Bund, who weren't Zionists. They were kind of a federation of Jewish
Yes,
workers.
they were not Zionists.
but they were sort of culturally nationalist, but wanted to be part of the Marxist movement. So in his construction, the Zionists were bourgeois nationalists. That was the term. They were dividing the working class. They were refusing to dissolve into the universal Marxist revolution. And that laid the grounds for the Soviet Yabsektia that I mentioned earlier to take over and apply Lenin's ideas and start persecuting Jews. Now, another proto form of anti-Zionism was the Nazi Islamist axis. So people like Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Mufti of Jerusalem and Mandatory Palestine, he was closely connected with the Muslim Brotherhood, who were connected with the Nazis. This was a very important alliance between early Islamists and Nazis that emerged in the 1930s and then in the 1940s. Haj Amin al-Husseini was actually a Nazi. He lived in Berlin during World War II, and he helped spread Nazi Arab propaganda throughout the Middle East and incite violence, like the Farhud. So that lineage too has not gone away because it's a central part of basically all jihadist movements that split from the Muslim Brotherhood. So Al-Qaeda to Hezbollah to ISIS, all of these movements have been inspired by what the Muslim Brotherhood did and what Sayyid Qutb developed, who is an important Muslim Brotherhood thinker who absorbed much of this Islamist anti-Judaism, much of this Nazi anti-Semitic conspiracism. So that's also a key proto-anti-Zionist, let's say pre-1948 lineage. But I think the purified form we see today came out of the alliance between the Soviet Union and Arab nationalists after the State of Israel was created.
I see. What is your definition of science?
So I think that really existing Zionism ended in 1948. So Zionism was the project to create a Jewish state. And at that level, Zionism is completed. Now, there are other usages of the term. You could talk about religious Zionism, which is a certain kind of theology and politics today in Israel. But overall, Zionism is largely something completed. I think that anti-Zionism is far more interesting than Zionism, right? But so much of the global discourse is saturated with conversations about Zionism. If you told me that in the 19th century a small minority people wanted a state for itself, I'd say, okay, there were maybe hundreds of those small peoples who wanted a state for themselves. That's not very interesting. What's really interesting is there are hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, who are going on the streets on a weekly basis and screaming about how Israel is the worst thing in the entire universe, right? There's an entire global complex based on spreading libels about Israel. There are more resolutions against Israel in the United Nations than against any other state, right? That's a significant phenomenon, and it's for some reason is rarely spoken about. So anti-Zionism poses itself like it's against some kind of belief system. So Zionism is a belief system that someone may or may not have. Anti-Zionists are people who disagree with this belief system. Is not actually a belief. It's just a reality. The state existing is a reality. And in practice, anti-Zionists are not people who disagree with a belief. They're people who just hate a whole country. So anti-Zionism is not criticism of Zionism. It's a way of targeting, first of all, Israelis as a national group, as an inherently illegitimate and evil population. And secondly, all of the so-called Zionists that they mark as Zionists that they hate, which are basically proxy Israelis in their mind. Anti-Zionism is just a way of targeting a group and discriminating against a group. Of course, it constructs itself as if it's critique of a belief, but it's not. We know that it was a way of targeting actual people.
Adam, do you consider that the Jews are an indigenous people related to the land of Israel? Yes, and how would you defend this?
I worked with indigenous people in the Amazon, and something that I learned there was in the way that they understand indigeneity, the way they understand their relationship to territory, to their identity as a people across time, is not that they've always been in the same place. And if you look at the ethnography from all around the world, from Native American tribes in North America or groups in Oceania and Southeast Asia, they actually have rich migration stories of moving around the world. They have diasporas. What's important is not that they've stayed in the same place, but there is a place on this planet that is their sacred origin site. and through which they define their identity and their civilization. And they might have sort of spread out from that origin site, or maybe they'll understand themselves as returning to that origin site at the end of time. Now, the land of Israel is so central to Jewish civilization, and it is understood in those terms. It is the sacred land, it's the holy land, it's the promised land. It's both where we spread out from in diaspora and where we understood ourselves always as destined to return to. And in that sense, it's a form of indigeneity that's very similar to the way many indigenous groups around the world understand themselves.
After your investigations, what is the reason for all this hatred? Can you come with an explanation? What nuisance are we causing and to who?
Oh, we aren't actually doing anything. It's not rational, but it's a way of scapegoating the Jews. So earlier anti-Jewish ideology scapegoated Jews for the moral wrongs of the time. So in the medieval times, Jews were the worst thing you could possibly be. Jews were the killers of Christ. Jews killed Christian children. Jews desecrated the host. When anti-Semitism, classical anti-Semitism emerges in the 19th century, Jews are now responsible for economic inequalities with banking, etc., are treated as being behind every evil in the world as kind of a world conspiracy that's trying to destroy and disrupt the nation.
Who wanted to, who was using them as scapegoat?
So if you look at Germany, for example, Germany was trying to constitute itself as a modern nation, and sort of reaffirm its national identity, especially after the humiliations of Germany's loss in World War I. And Germany developed this stab in the back myth, and so blamed the Jews for their failures as a nation and their difficulties in constituting themselves as a successful nation state. So anti-Semitism imagined Jews as infiltrating and disrupting the nation state. Now today, Israel is not considered as disrupting a nation state, but instead it's disrupting the whole international order after World War II. These are all the accusations that are thrown onto Israel. So Israel's really constructed as just the inverse of whatever is considered morally valuable today. So the scapegoating adapts to the moral sensibilities of the time. So that's why Israel is seen as colonial, because everyone hates colonialism now. That's why Israel is seen as a white state or a hyper white supremacist state, because there's all this consciousness about racism and white supremacy. So it's projecting all of those sins and evils onto Israel.
You were on the Amazon jungle in Colombia studying the Desana people when October 7th happened. How did you experience that moment, both personally and intellectually? And when did you decide that your identity and career could no longer remain separate?
I was in an indigenous village, living with the Desana people for about 3 months without any phone or computer or internet or anything. And I returned to this local town, Me Too, on October 9th. So it had been 2 days actually since the events had taken place. I opened my computer and the very first thing I saw was news of the events. And what I saw immediately after was how my left-wing colleagues in academia were reacting, and they were already attacking Israel, justifying violence. I posted some form of basic solidarity with Israelis. They would come onto my wall and start posting pictures of people burning Israeli flags. At that moment, I was faced with a choice, right? I could continue, I could speak out, I could be silent, or I could be a token anti-Zionist. Now, I didn't think being token anti-Zionist was right, because I was looking at what was occurring and the violence and the genocidal acts that were committed against Israel, and something felt extremely wrong about that, and extremely wrong as well the way people were responding. Or I could be silent. And I just chose to keep speaking the truth. I investigated what was happening. I investigated the claims of genocide. I saw that the things people were saying about Jewish identity, Jews are not a real people, Jews are fake, was offensive and was not true and was contrary to what I understood as a Jew. And so I decided to keep speaking out. But yes, very quickly I saw and I was told explicitly, you can't have a career in anthropology if you are pro-Israel, if you are a Zionist. You're destroying your reputation by even standing with Israel at all. If you talk about anti-Semitism as well, that marks you as a Zionist. Some people stopped collaborating with me because they said, oh, you use anti-Semitism to justify Israel's genocide. So it soon became clear to me that I wouldn't have a career in anthropology, but I just felt that it was important to keep speaking out. Eventually, I lost basically all my social and professional connections in that world. I reconnected more with the Jewish community, and people started to take an interest in what I was writing and finding it helpful, and that's how I got to where I am right now.
And this is how the academia punishes who dare to speak.
Academia is basically purging Zionists from the humanities. The people who are still there, unfortunately, have been forced into silence. But in some ways, it was good that I was given the opportunity to speak that truth and to share that truth so people know what's happening in academia. And people can also see that it's possible to speak back to anti-Zionism using much of the same academic language and critical frameworks that I'd internalized. Right? We really talk about, for example, the valuing and taking seriously the voice of persecuted minorities in a lot of these ethical frameworks. We talk about how we should not be complicit in erasing the distinct and vulnerable identities of minorities. All of this was exactly what they were doing to Jews. So the whole thing was upside down, and I needed to find a way to flip it right side up.
So what is the future for you? What are your plans?
I can't tell you exactly, but I'm going to continue working on the movement against anti-Zionism and to keep getting this message out there and try create the institutional and social change that I think is really, really urgent and necessary. We have to be able to stigmatize anti-Zionism itself, and that takes actual work. It involves placing attention on anti-Zionism and describing all the terrible things anti-Zionists do, because they do lots of terrible things. They vandalize homes, they boycott businesses, they discriminate against Israelis. We can't disconnect the anti-Zionist hate movement as well as it exists in Western countries from the anti-Zionist violence against Israel itself, the anti-Zionist genocide on October 7th, various anti-Zionist militias like Hezbollah and the Houthis or the Iranian regime. So it's one interconnected system of numerous totalitarian criminal militias and governments, of a hate movement in Western countries. So we just need to place attention on it because it's all there and it's very, very ugly and it has an ugly history. So it's not hard to stigmatize in terms of what it is itself. It's that it's just not often done. It's not often the object of attention, and that's what we need to do. We need to place it on the dock and have it answer for its own crimes. Any action Israel takes will be interpreted in the worst light. They're constantly trying to claim that Israel has committed some crime. They're trying to criminalize the existence of Israel. There is no rational discourse here. It is a hate movement. It views Israel as inherently evil, and so it can justify violence against Israelis, against the state of Israel, and against Jews around the world who are marked as so-called Zionists.
You propose that anti-Zionism be treated as a hate movement with concrete consequences. Do you believe the Jewish communities should have a permanent legal department dedicated to denouncing anti-Semitism as a continuous institutional strategy?
So I think that we need to recognize another category. So we need to have anti-Semitism, and then we need to recognize anti-Zionism as its own category of bigotry. We need a legal category. So anti-Zionism targets a protected group, Israelis, and then it targets Zionists as proxy Israelis. The Jewish community, Jewish institutions need to start condemning anti-Zionism directly. So if they put out a condemnation, not just say we are against anti-Semitism, but we are against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. If anti-Zionists commit violent acts against Jews, we need to say this was anti-Zionist violence. This was an anti-Zionist murder. So at how we speak, at how we conceptualize, at how we bring lawsuits, how we develop the law, we need to focus and hone in on anti-Zionism as its own problem. Because we've done a lot on Holocaust education and classical anti-Semitism, which comes from the right. But then when it comes to anti-Zionism, there's no clarity. People call it criticism of Israel, or they don't know where to draw the line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism because it's really not classical anti-Semitism. Those descriptive matrices are not the right way to see anti-Zionism. So we need to allow it to breathe as its own category and condemn it as such.
So where do you draw the line of anti-Zionism? What is your definition?
Anti-Zionism is a hate movement against people who are marked as Zionists. In some ways, it's that simple. Another level, it's Israel hatred, right? We know that Israel hatred is a major movement that there are millions of people around the world who despise Israel. And then there's this endless conversation. Well, are they secretly anti-Semitic? Is it because they don't like Jews in general, or do they just really hate Israel? But when we pose it that way, we never say, well, actually, they're not allowed to hate Israel. This virulent genocidal hatred against Israel itself should be seen as wrong. So we need to actually say that Israel hate is wrong. And that's something that can sometimes be hard because it's so normalized. And there's a lot of internalization. And there are Jews too who've internalized a bit of Israel hate, of Israel bashing. But we need to allow everyone, the whole society, to develop a sensibility for Israel hate and start shutting it down, regardless of whether it looks like classical anti-Semitism or not.
And now you found the movement against anti-Zionism. What can this movement do that traditional Jewish organizations like ADL are not doing?
It's bringing anti-Zionism into attention. And there's a reason we called it the movement against anti-Zionism and not the movement for Zionism, right? Because we don't see anti-Zionism as just opposition to Zionism. We see it as its own ideology. And that's why we also think it's very important to write anti-Zionism without the hyphen, to make that clear that anti-Zionism is just its own thing. So there are many groups, organizations that combat anti-Semitism, stop anti-Semitism. No one ever asks them, oh, does that mean you're pro-Semitism? Right. But we are occasionally asked, well, why are you called the movement against anti-Zionism? Shouldn't you just be the movement for Zionism? But actually, it's the same thing. Being against anti-Zionism does not mean you're specifically Zionist. Everyone should be against anti-Zionism. It's just a bigotry. And that is the key move we're trying to make. So we understand our movement as a civil rights movement. We're going out into the public. We are confronting an active hate movement. It's negative politics. We're saying no to it, and we're demanding our rights as Jews in the face of anti-Zionism. I think these organizations need to shift into that more proactive mode, less passive, less reactive, less just trying to do things behind the scenes, and be willing to change the cultural narrative, really transform the discourse that's taken place since October 7th.
And when you see Israeli politics now and some very controversial persons that many times make more harm than good for the image of Israel, what do you think?
So I think someone like Ben Gvir is definitely not a good person. I don't necessarily agree with his politics and his antics, but I think sometimes the Jewish community gets lost in the claims themselves, right? So we saw mass condemnations around the world of Ben Gvir's behavior with the flotilla activists. That was very unusual, right? A random minister in a small country arrests people who have entered their country and they were manhandled a little bit. That's not a crazy global event, but we saw the government of Canada, we saw the government of Spain, we saw European countries issuing statements about it. That's unusual. I don't like Ben Gvir anyway, so I'm going to participate in this. But what we've lost there is seeing seeing the apple, seeing the anti-Zionist complex, that these global condemnations come from a place of normalized Israel hate. So even if we don't like that politician, even if we don't even approve of his actions, there is something else going on here, and we need to keep our eye on the ball and actually call out the anti-Zionist complex. It's like the New York Times with Nicholas Kristof dog rape libel. The New York Times has an entire history before October 7th, but specifically after October 7th, of libels against Israel, unverified claims that ended up being false, like the Al-Ahli hospital bombing they said was Israel at the beginning of the war, but was actually an Islamic Jihad rocket. There's really uncountable false claims that they've made about Israel, but they don't stop. So even when some of them turn out to be false and they admit it, they'll offer a little correction in the margin somewhere that no one reads, and then they'll do it again. Because the behavior itself, the pattern itself, has not been directly named and condemned, and people haven't come forward and said, well, actually, I want you to stop systemic anti-Zionism at the New York Times. I want to stop systemic anti-Zionist libel. All institutions who are engaging in it need to be held accountable. So you need that name in order to start actually mobilizing people to change their behavior.
Is this worldwide wave of anti-Semitism directly tied to the war? And will it end when the conflict ends? Or will it get embedded into global culture? What do you think?
So it's not dependent on the war. The October 7th genocide was a catalyst to spread anti-Zionism through the world, to basically escalate anti-Zionism in ways we've never seen before. Anti-Zionism pre-existed, but it's now kind of past a threshold and become completely saturated in popular culture. It will continue to exist even when even when there isn't a war. Any kind of event in Israel will be an occasion to circulate anti-Zionist libels. They will keep trying to push the boycott and say Israel's an apartheid state. They'll say it's an ongoing genocide. Now, the conflict as a whole with Palestinians, I would say it's actually the opposite. So anti-Zionism needs to be defeated for that conflict to be solved, rather than if the conflict were solved, anti-Zionism being gone. We need to get rid of systemic anti-Zionism in the Middle East in order to allow a solution.
What do you think about Trump's behaviors?
Well, obviously, he's been very supportive of Israel. He immediately saw what was happening on campuses in the United States, and he tried to shut it down. Now, of course, they didn't necessarily do it effectively. They sometimes did overreach in terms of academic freedom and how much they wanted to meddle with the universities. They obviously used the language of anti-Semitism. So they reproduced at some level a bit of the narrative of anti-Zionists, which is that anyone who calls them anti-Semitism is some right-wing Zionists. They're part of a right-wing conspiracy to shut down their righteous speech. That's how anti-Zionists victimize themselves when people try to hold them accountable for Jew hatred.
Thank you so
Great.
much. Thank
Thank
you
you so much. Thank you.
for this interview.